I love this song. I sing it all the time. 40 acres.
Me too. 快乐。
I wouldn't either. That's all this.
我都不怕我累坏，我就怕这小宝累坏了。
小哥，
I think one of the biggest things is, here, teams of championships is
why can I hear?
but for us, the last 4 years, we kind of, well, seven really playing deep into October. We've come pretty accustomed to short off seasons, and we're pretty well equipped. Get back out here in spring training and do what we need to do to prepare and get ready for the season ahead of us. So
Arriba, hombres de la tierra, de miedos esclavos, insurjan la razón en marcha, es el fin de la opresión. El pasado hay que ser añicos, cañones claman y a vencer. El mundo va a cambiar de base, los de hoy todo han de ser. Agrutémonos todos en la lucha final y se hacen los pueblos por la internacional. Agrupémonos todos en la lucha final y se hacen los pueblos con valor por la internacional. Arise, ye prisoners of starvation, arise, ye wretched on the earth. For justice thunders condemnation, a better world's in birth. No more traditions change shall bind us, arise, ye say, no more enthralled. The earth shall rise a new foundation, nothing up, we shall be all. 'Tis the final conflict, let each stand in their place. The international working class shall be the human race. 'Tis the final conflict, let each stand in their place. The international working class shall be the human race.
Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for being here with us today. And it is customary that we start off with a land acknowledgement. And so, first off, I would like to take a moment to acknowledge that we are on Tongva and Quiche land and recognize them as the traditional caretakers of Tovangar, the Los Angeles Basin and Southern Channel Islands, what we now call home. We would also like to pay our respects to the Onukvatam ancestors, Airom elders, and Ayukine, our relatives, relations, past, present, and emerging. So before we move on, we would like for you all to utilize this land acknowledgement tool So all you have to do is text your city and state to the phone number that's right here that appears on your screen on the right-hand side. That's 1-855-917-5263. And so all you have to do, again, is text them your city and your state. Like, for example, I live in Pomona, California. So I would text Pomona, California to the phone number, and then they will text me back and they will tell me whose land I'm on. And then they'll tell me that Pomona, California is Quiche and Tongva land. So if you all can please acknowledge the land that you are on by texting that phone number, and then once you get that text message back where you find out which land you are on or whose land you are on, please go ahead and type it into the chat, just like this right here in the bottom. For example, Pomona equals Quiche and Tongva land. Please join us in acknowledging the land, everybody. Thank you all so much for being here.
All right, thank you, Fabian. Hello, everyone. Welcome to our event today. This is a collaboration between El Centro and the Arise program. My name is Dr. Annabelle Perez, and I'm happy to be here with you today, along with my colleague, also known as my hermana, which will introduce herself next.
I'm on mute there. I apologize. Welcome everybody to this event. We are so excited to be here with all of you, 92 and counting today. My name is Dr. Ida Cuenza Uvas, and I am the director for the Arise program. So we're just excited to be here, and you'll learn more about our program later on, I think, at the very end, but we are excited. Thank you. Oh, I do want to acknowledge that one of our trustees is here, Laura Santos. So want to say a shout out to her. Thank you for being here with us today.
Thank you.
I'll further acknowledge our other trustee, Carrie Chow. Thank you for making the time to be with us today. We really, really appreciate it. This is a dream come true for both of our programs to be able to host this type of event, especially the day before Cesar Chavez Day is celebrated, which is tomorrow. So welcome everyone, and we're excited to have you here today. Ida and I are going to go ahead and talk just very briefly about our programs. So like we mentioned, this is a collaboration between the Arise and El Centro program. And so I'll have my colleague here start with the Arise program.
Sure, thank you, Annabelle. Yeah, the Arise program has actually been around since 2011 when we first received the ANAPISI grant. It's a federal grant that stands for the Asian American, Native American, Pacific Islanders Serving Institutions. So we are now currently in our second grant. And our program is a support program for students. We have a number of different culturally relevant programming that we do, which includes things like educational field trips. The picture that you see in here on the right is actually a field trip where we took a number of students in our program and also from other equity type programs and got to actually visit Delano. But in addition to that, we have a number of counselors and advisors that also provide some academic support to students. But we especially are prideful of the culturally relevant programming that we do for our students. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. And it gives me great pleasure. I forgot to mention that I'm the council coordinator of the Bridge program. And for the last 2 years or so, I've been supporting the efforts of El Centro. So El Centro is a baby in the world of student services programming because we've been around officially for 2 years. And so the mission of El Centro is to unite all cultural backgrounds, Latinx and Chicanx, to support, educate, and assist students in completing their educational goals at Mount SAC, while at the same time providing cultural enrichment, solidarity between Mount SAC students and our surrounding communities. I do want to share that even though our program has been officially at Mount SAC for 2 years, unofficially it's been around for quite longer. It is really due to the fact that students from MECHA, students from the Pride Center, students from IDEAS, and the Dream Center really advocated for Mount SAC to create a space and programming specifically for Chicanx and Latinx students. And so I don't want to be remiss to not mention that El Centro exists because of the hard work, activism, and really voices of the students who said Mount SAC needs to have a program specifically for Latinx students, because unfortunately, Latinx students continue to be a group that we don't get to higher education. And so the students saw this connection between learning about your culture as increasing educational attainment at Mount SAC. And so we wanted to share that because, you know, history is everything sometimes, and it's important to provide the correct type of historical context when it comes to El Centro. This is a dream come true, like I mentioned, for our programs. 2 years ago, actually a year ago, even though it feels like 2 years ago, right before COVID hit, Arise and El Centro had already been talking and planning to have this event on campus, but of course, because of COVID, we weren't able to do so. So we wanted to provide a space today to continue to have this kind of conversation and learn more about really the collaboration between the Mexican community and the Filipino community when it comes to the farm workers movement. Oftentimes, especially if you've been listening to what's going on in the world and in the news, communities tend to be separated, right? And this example today is really a reflection of what we hope will continue to happen, which is collaboration amongst programs, so that we can see the connections that different communities have that have partnered together to make sure that issues of social justice, issues of labor injustices are attended to. So I just wanted to share, and Ida, if you want to add anything, feel free. That this is a dream come true, and that we really hope that you will enjoy the rest of our program today. So thank you for being here. All right, so what we have planned for you today is we're gonna do a quick activity. Of course, if it's in El Centro and a RISE program, there always has to be some kind of activity, you know, to get us going, to kind of test your knowledge of what you already know about the farm workers movement. We're going to have our wonderful professor, April Thayes-Wagner, give us a historical context of the farm workers movement. We have these wonderful gentlemen, Alex and Roger. Trust me, you're in for a treat. Once you meet them, you will feel like they're family, which is what a perfect emotion to get from our wonderful speakers. And then I took over. Ida, go for it. Finish us off with the last two.
That's great. No worries, Annabelle. You know, we always love to kind of coordinate it like this. Yeah, so I'm excited for us to have that space with Alex and Roger. You're also going to have an opportunity to ask questions and share your own reflection testimonies. And you can do it in a couple of ways. Certainly, there are some shy folks in the audience, I would imagine, but we're going to have you use what's called Padlet. And I've just dropped that in the chat. It's a way for you to share your thoughts, your reflections, ask questions. We'll be using that later on during the actual question and answer portion to maybe highlight some of the questions or thoughts, just as a way to engage. But we hope you do use that Padlet as a way to contribute to the conversation we have today. And then we'll wrap up with an evaluation and conclusion that will include some announcements about some upcoming activities. So, and of course, the research guide that our two lovely researchers, librarians in here, Eva and Hong, I want to just say a big shout out and thank you for the work that you do in the library to make equity at the forefront of our work. So thank you for that. So we'll be sharing about that at the end. So let's get started. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Tutasi. I'm the program specialist for the Arise program. It's my pleasure to start off this event with a little bit of an icebreaker. But before I do that, I just want to add to what Annabelle shared about this dream come true. You know, it's so great and it's so powerful. I keep looking at the participants. The numbers were over 100 right now. But it's just so great to build community with students, faculty, staff, board of trustees. And also I see a lot of our alumni students out there. So I just want to thank you all for joining us. You know, even though we're square to square, I really feel right now shoulder to shoulder with each of you. Again, building community and recognizing the heroes from our farm workers, from the farm workers movement. So as Fabian, it's been so awesome watching all of you post in your land acknowledgements. It's really powerful. I didn't mention that. And it's a great thing for all of us to build this awareness, right? For land acknowledgement. But the thing that we also want to get into is this labor acknowledgement. So as we honor the land we're on, also we honor those who are able to continue to labor on this land. So with that said, I'm going to ask you a series of questions, and I'm going to be looking into the chat to see if you can either type in the exact answer or A, B, C, or D, okay? And I'll give you the answer after. So first question, the movement established workers' right to A, organize, B, secured better pay, C, secure better working conditions, or D, all of the above. I see a lot of answers for all of the above, and you are correct. The answer is all of the above. So those great workers are able to organize, get better pay, and also better the working conditions. Next question. Next question, in the 19th century, which workers did most of the low-paid, physically demanding agriculture work in states like California and Arizona? Was it A, Chinese, B, Japanese, C, Filipino, or D, Mexican, or E, all of the above? If you put E, I know, really smart audience. If you put E, you are correct. It was all of the above. So all these communities worked for these low-paying jobs that were physically demanding. Thank you. Good job, everyone. Next question. I associate the farm workers movement with A, Cesar Chavez, B, Larry Itliong, C, Dolores Huerta, D, all of the above, or E, I'm not sure. This is a tricky one. The answer is D. And you're right, Ida, it is okay to be unsure if you don't know, because that's why you're here, to learn more about the farm workers movement and all those who are associated. So the answer again is D, all three. Next question. True or false? Filipino farm workers in Delano, California initiated a grape strike in 1965. Remember, this is a 50-50 question, so I'm thinking back to when I was taking tests. The answer is true. Filipino farm workers in Delano initiated the grape strike movement, a grape strike in 1965. And I believe that's the last of our questions. Oh no, last one, perfect. Cesar Chavez Day is oh no, wait, there's actually two more questions. So this one, Cesar Chavez Day is a state holiday or a federal holiday? Yes, I see a lot of A's. Exactly, the state of California, which I'm proud to live in. It's a state holiday for Cesar Chavez Day. And then I believe this is the last question. Cesar Chavez Day is March 31st because that's his favorite day. B, that's his birthday. Or C, that's the anniversary of the farm workers' strike. The answer is B, correct, very good. That it's his birthday, March 31st, which is tomorrow. So as the state of California, we recognize and celebrate this day with the day off. And it's probably that's probably a trick question, because maybe his birthday is his favorite day, but maybe not. But I believe that's the last question. Am I right? For those of you who got all of them correct, give yourselves a pat on the back. For those of you who were unsure about some of the things, that's why you're here again, and we're all just here to build community. With that, thank you so much, everyone, for playing our icebreaker, and I'm going to turn the time over to Fabian.
Thank you so much, Tassi. I really appreciate you doing the icebreakers. I don't think I know anybody else that doesn't better than you. No offense to anybody else that's here, that's a staff or faculty here, but I mean, I think the Tassi does it best, hands down. Thank you so much again for being here. So I have the honor of introducing Professor April Tellez Wagner. And so Professor Tellez is actually a professor of history here at Mount San Antonio College. And she teaches classes such as US history, history of the Mexican American. She's also taught classes such as history of Mexico. And I've actually had the privilege of taking her history of Mexico and history of the Mexican American classes. And so she does a great job at awakening students and really connecting the issues of the past to the present and really helping us understand the importance of learning about our history, learning about our culture, and using our stories as our biggest weapon in the battle and the movement towards social justice. So if you all can please show some love, snap back at home. We're not gonna be able to hear you, but snap or show some love on the chat to Professor April Tellez Wagner, everybody.
Thank you so much for the introduction, Fabian. I really appreciate it. And I appreciate everything that you've been doing on campus. You are a force to be reckoned with. And hopefully one day soon you will be, my office mate, right? So I have a place right there next, right there for you. All right, awesome. Okay, so I'm going to begin. I know I only have 20 minutes, so I'm going to try to fill a history. I don't know if it's repeating for you. Can you guys hear it repeating?
It was.
There's an echo. There's an echo. Okay, it went away. So like I was saying, I'm going to try to fill in a lot of history in a brief time, because we cannot talk about the farm workers movement as just originating in 1965. We cannot talk about the farm workers movement as just originating in 1962 with the formation of the National Farm Workers Association that gave birth to or became United Farm Workers. We have to go back in history, right? A long time in history to really understand and place it into historical context and understand the key players in the movement itself. All right, so in doing so, we need to begin with Indigenous peoples, right? And so I really appreciate the fact that the land acknowledgement is done. It's done in Senate. It's done, every time I've seen in the last year, maybe year and a half, at any event, we acknowledge Indigenous peoples and as stewards of the land and resisting colonization. And I appreciate that a lot. So I'm going to continue on with that just briefly. All right, so let's begin with natives because their roots are the deepest in this land. Long before the United States was established, the land of California was lived on and stewarded by more than 200 tribes, right, including the Tolowa and the Yurok in the north that borders Oregon, all the way to the Ipe and Tipe to the south, which is now the border with Mexico. Native peoples thrived on this land, maintaining a responsible and efficient balance with the fertility of the land. It is no wonder why so many Native nations called California their home. And this is important to understand because as probably most of you, or if not all of you are aware of, California is the 5th largest economy in the world, right? So we are the largest economy in the United States, but the 5th largest in the world. We could operate indistinct, right, of the United States, arguably, right? Particularly because of our agricultural fertility, right? So this is why so many indigenous nations lived on, and not just lived on and survived, but they thrived on the land that we now call home, right? So the same fertile land would undergo agricultural industrialization in the 20th century, and within decades would be home to some of the richest agribusinesses and agricultural corporations, including Shenley and DiGiorgio corporations, amongst many, many others. In fact, those corporations are the ones who are two of the ones that are going to exploit Filipino, Japanese, Chinese, Mexican-American laborers, right? And will give rise to the United Farm Workers movement, as well as the AFW movement under AWOC, which is the Agricultural Workers Organizing Committee. That actually began a strike a week before the UFW joined. All right, I'm going to continue on with a little more history again to help us understand, how these ethnicities came to be, what their role was prior to even the 1960s. All right, so after the Spanish invaded the lands of the Americas, including what we now call the US Southwest, Spanish constituents, including mestizos and criollos, rose up against the Spanish crown and claimed independence from Spain in 1821. California now belonged to Mexico. Although there was during this time white settlement in what is now called, instead of California, it had been previously called California, right? So it was the Alta California, right? So it was a Mexican state. Right, there were whites who still lived here, right? But they were living here on Mexican land, and that's important to understand, right? So it was claimed in 1821, right? All right. So although there was white people who were living here, right? It was still Mexican land, and this is going to change, right? So this is going to change when we have the United States, who is really predicated upon manifest destiny, this ideology of it is my right to take over all of, sea to shining sea, from the Atlantic, which we already conquered, which was indigenous lands, right, all the way to the Pacific. But mind you, the US Southwest had always been indigenous land. All the Americas had been indigenous land. We understand that, right? And then it was claimed by Spain, right? But when Spain had claimed it, right, it became considered, part of New Spain, what was called New Spain. And then when you have the criollos and the mestizos rise up and the independence is gained in 1821, now belongs to Mexico. So we have to follow this trajectory. And I know there's a lot, but it's really, really important to consider, right? So now we have the United States, who's a player in this, right? And who opts to take over more land, who feels not only it's their right, but mind you, they feel it's their duty, right? So Manifest Destiny, is this idea that it's the Judeo-Christian God ordained the land to them. And it was not only their right, but their obligation to fulfill this, right? So they bring, they have these ideas of bringing forth civilization, right? And so what does that result in? Well, that results in massive, horrific removals and genocidal policies, both physical as well as cultural, of indigenous nations all across the United States, in particular in the South, right? In addition to that, it also will lead forth to President James K. Polk, who instigates a war that Mexico did not want in 1846, right? So with this instigation of war, right, within 2 years, the United States takes over, right, almost nearly half, right, a little less than half of Mexico's land, which again includes California, right? So during this time, right, during the actual Mexican-American War, it's 1 week, it's 1848, it's 1 week before the signing of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo in February of 1848. And gold is found at John Sutter's mill, right, in Northern California. And when they find the gold, they immediately start to expedite the process of, the war had already existed, they were about to sign the treaty, but they're going to expedite the process of now admitting California as a state. Because when you admit California as a state, right, you now have more economic favorability, right, available from that state, right? So we're looking at this, right? So we have to see who is here and what happens. Well, California quickly is admitted as a state in 1850. Gold is found, right, in 1848. California is admitted as a state in 1850. In between that year and a half or so, right, in between that, you have, the gold rush will attract people not only from the United States, right, Anglo-Saxons, right, from, the Northeast. It'll attract, Anglo-Saxons, Euro-Americans from the South, who, remember, this is pre-Civil War. So you will have, these Euro-Americans who are slave owners who will bring forth their slaves with them, right? Incidentally enough, and interestingly enough as well, California was admitted as a free state, and yet there were legal loopholes. Okay, you could bring your luggage. So they would refer to African-Americans, right, to refer to the slaves as luggage to bypass that. So what do we have here? We have indigenous peoples, right? 200 nations. Some, in fact, by this time, have already been obliterated through genocidal policies and also through biological warfare, pathogens, and diseases. So we have indigenous nations, we have Mexicans. Now we have Mexican Americans, the creation of a new ethnic group. How does that come about? How does that make sense? Because now we have this man-made border constructed, right? Our contemporary border, right? So now we have, in Texas or Texas, it's the Rio Grande, right? In California, we know it as, you have San Diego, then you have Tijuana, right? So these man-made borders are constructed. So we have Mexican Americans, we have Mexicans here, right? We have natives here. Now it becomes a global, we have Anglo-Saxons coming as well, right? And we have African Americans as luggage, right? But really as slaves. So we have all these populations, and now it's not only a domestic, occurrence, right? It becomes global on scale, right? And so we have, the Chinese who come, so many groups come to obtain gold, right? They refer to it as Gold Mountain, and they would refer to that in Tagalog. Some Filipinos came as well. They refer to it in Mandarin, right? In Cantonese as well, Gold Mountain. So we had the Chinese come, we had Filipinos come, right? We had Japanese come later, not originally in the 1850s. They'll come more late 1870s, but they will still come with those hopes, right? And also for agricultural purposes as well. So we have Chileans come, right? They had been silver miners for hundreds of years. We have Peruvians. Their mining goes back all the way, we're talking about like 800 years, right? To the Incan Empire and its origins, even before it was that massive empire where they mined for gold, right? We have Australians come, French, Germans, Italians. We have, the British come. We have people from all over the world come to obtain the gold. Now, this is going to set the stage for the, the diversity and in California alone, right? Now, what's going to happen is not only is the United States, interested and has now, quote unquote, fulfilled manifest destiny, but it still wants to legally maintain white hegemony, so white institutionalized power. And in order to do so, right, what starts to erupt is mass hysteria. So people of color, they open it up to people of color to come initially, and they're utilized and exploited, let's use the right word, as, a cheap labor source, right? But as soon as, quote unquote, too many, Chinese are here, or too many later, a little bit later, but too many Japanese are here or taking the white man's job, what ends up happening is that very strict immigration policies are now prescribed. They're now instituted due to this mass hysteria. And I think it's very timely to also recognize the mass hysteria that exists, because during the 1870s, 1880s, 1890s, there was what was called the Yellow Peril movement. Now, we are aware that peril means danger, right? So this idea that they would refer to them derogatorily, obviously we don't use those words, but like, right, the yellow people are dangerous, the Chinaman is dangerous, etc. right? They also had these notions about the Filipinos, right? They couldn't necessarily place them exactly, but they would refer to them in that, you're non-white, so you're not welcome here. So there's already this history, we're talking about the 1850s, 60s, 70s, of being very pro-white, anti-people of color. And remember that they were, allowed in, and it was publicized. It's hard to keep something like the gold rush under wraps anyway, but it was publicized because it was already a forethought. Let's allow these people to come over, make life so hellish for them. They're poor already, a lot of them coming over. They cannot leave. They don't have the access to leave, but what can we meanwhile do to them? We can use them as a cheap labor force. Right, so it's instituted, right? It's like a pre-narrative, right? It's not just accidental or coincidental what happened, right? So they become a quote unquote cheap labor force, and so the roots. Look at number one, it's a multi-ethnic community, and go back to the indigenous, our discussion of the indigenous lands and the fertility of the land. That's also important as well, because what starts to develop? Then we have the Industrial Revolution, right? We have the undergoing in the 19th century, the 1800s. So now we have like farm worker, technologies, right? McCormick was one of the big corporations, right? So tilling of the land became easier. You have all these farming, farming cooperatives and farming agribusinesses that open up. And what are they built on? They're built on two things: exploitation of people of color and racism, right? And also, I would also add exploitation of all people. But instituted in those policies, instituted in that history, was what we call a tiered racialized labor system. So everyone under these agricultural corporations, everyone was exploited, period, to some extent. However, exploitation was not across the board in all ways. There were tiered labor systems. Now, Ida, earlier, I think it was Ida that mentioned about the divide and conquer mechanisms, and you're absolutely right. Here is a very profound historical example that we need to take note of, right? Because divide and conquer is not some supposition or this idea that just, exists, but with little regard or hypothetically. It really is instituted, and the racialized tiered labor system tried to get people of color and also poor whites to fight against people who are beneath them, right? And so by doing this, what did we do? We separated people, attempted to, right? And not when I say we, not you or I, but these agribusinesses, these capitalist enterprises wanted people to fight each other so that way they could maintain hegemony, maintain the power, and maintain their exploitation and their mass profits over, over all people beneath them. Right. And so going back to, the anti-immigrant stances, I'm just going to quickly mention, because it's very important, the 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act. I mean, this was the first official act to entirely bar a whole ethnic group from immigrating into the United States officially, right? And that will be sort of lifted with sort of, when I say sort of, very slight amendments made to it in 1924. So you're looking at like more than 40 years, right? And then really not completely until 1965. Now, meanwhile, other things are happening as well. The United States will go into the Philippines, right? We have to look at the Spanish-American War. When we go into, right, so the Spanish-American War went into Cuba, the Philippines, Guam, the Wake Islands, right? We did horrendous things, particularly to, in the Philippines, particularly to Filipinos, right? We also in Cuba, we did horrible things. Now, why is this part of the farm worker trajectory? Why is this part of the history? Because you have to understand it, right? Because it's going to lead to mass immigration. It is a truth that whenever there is exploitation, and in particular, a governmental colonization of another land, that will necessarily lead to the people fleeing. It's like going into your neighbor's house, extracting 3/4 of all their goods and taking it to your house, Where are your neighbors going to go to seek either goods and or work with the goods that you now have stolen? They're going to go to the neighbor's house. That's an easy way to look at colonization. So again, right, so you have Filipino immigration, right? You have mass immigration because of the colonization due to what we set up with the Spanish-American War, right? So I know that's a lot of history in a little time. You could take my class if you'd like to, and that would be awesome. I'd love to have you. But continuing on, so now we're in the 20th century, right? We have the Mexican Revolution from 1910 to 1920 that will bring forth a lot of Mexicans escaping the violence, including my grandmother, right? My grandmother was first generation, born here, or actually born in El Paso, right? But came to East LA and grew up there when she was 2. They were escaping the violence of the Mexican Revolution. So that's also important to consider, another immigration policy. So what do we have here? Now we have a system set up of agribusinesses where you have, I apologize, where you have people of color who are, who are here in a system that really, really doesn't want them, who are forced to take the lowest rungs of what society will dish out. In other words, they're going to be the farm laborers, right? And farm labor is harder. Farm laborers, I have so much respect for because they work harder than I ever have. And I'm the first to admit that. I'm the first to praise people who work, right, from literally from the ground, because you feed us, right? And I know that I get very angry and very, very passionate and very frustrated that there's such a disconnect, right? People sit down to pray, but yet they don't give homage to the people that actually pick the food, right, and grow the food. And that is horrible, and that is not acceptable, right? So I'm the first to say, I know I'm in a privileged position. I worked hard to be here, but at the same time, I'm in a privileged position, recognize that. All right, so that being said, so they're in the lowest rungs of society. Now we have World War I, right? And so we have the Filipinos here working in labor. We have, Mexicans, or Mexican Americans, excuse me. Then we have roughly about 3 million to 4 million, figures vary depending on what historian you're looking at. When we enter World War I, to 3 to 4 million soldiers leave, right, into the armed forces, right? So they deploy. So that leaves a lot of vacancies. So what does Woodrow Wilson do? He sets up a guest worker program. This guest worker program is where we look to Mexico and we say, hey, come over please and help us save our American capitalist system, because we need your labor, and we can't, we can't survive this as a country, let alone survive in the war if we don't have your labor. Now, as soon as the war is over and we don't need them, what do? We start repatriation, an official policy of repatriation, where we send more back than came. Wait, how does that make sense? Because we're sending back American citizens. We're racially, profiling, and we're just targeting people of color. Sometimes Filipinos were sent back as well, right? Sent back, but it's not even sent back. They were sent to Mexico mistakenly. Right, and that happened as well, right? So, and also Mexican Americans, right? And I have some stories I could share if I had more time, but I'll just keep it there, right? Fast forward, now we're looking at the Great Depression hits, right? We have the Roaring 20s, right? Which there's, definitely, women get the right to vote in 1920, white women in particular. We also have to recognize that, but we have some improvement, right? But then we also have backlash, and that's how I characterize the 1920s, right? There's massive consumerism, right? There's the stock market boom, and then there's the inevitable crash. Now, what does that mean? Well, let's look at it. Agribusinesses are hit, definitely. I mean, we have the Dust Bowl, right? We have a lot of problems environmentally. We're in shambles. Our capitalism had not been regulated, and so we're in shambles, right? And so who does that hit the hardest? It hits the hardest the people who are already on the bottom rungs of society. Now, what happens? The US government, it'll pass a series of New Deal programs, but it's not really instituted to help the laborer as much as it is to help those that are in like more of what's considered more of like a professional, these professional rungs of society. And so what ends up happening, well, these corporations, and let's go back to exclusively California, cotton, right? There's the cotton strike of 1933. There's a series of strikes which were started by the Filipino workers, right? It was in Delano, it was in Coachella, right? More than 47,000. Again, it was started in October of 1933, but it was began by Filipino workers, but side by side, they're working with Mexican laborers as well as Mexican American laborers, and they joined forces. It's a very, very beautiful story to tell how Filipino workers were able to amalgamate and create solidarity instead of doing exactly what the government had hoped and instituted that we do, which was divide and conquer, right? And so that's already an origin. So before we even get to the 1965 strike that began, right, September 8th with the Filipinos with Larry Itliong, we have to talk about 1933, right? Because that's where we see, you know, collaboration, solidarity. Now that ends by the end of October. There are minor concessions that are made by these agribusinesses, not enough. What the workers were asking for was 80 cents per 100 pounds, and they weren't even willing to do that. It was 75 cents they only gave. But nonetheless, there were some concessions that were made. Right, so that's an example going back into history. Now we're into World War II. And then the same thing happens. We have millions of men and women leave, right, as active duty, as nurses, etc. So what happens? We need to fill that void. So we, again, open up an official program called the Bracero program. On paper, it was supposed to be from 1942, right, to 1964, but we cut it short, right? And after the war is over, in 1954, there is a roundup of Mexican people's laborers, men, who came over here to help our war effort and help sustain our country to be able to fight a war, let alone to sustain itself as an actual, you know, world power. And, you know, we round people up, also some Mexican Americans as well this time, and we deport them to Mexico, which was not the premise of what was stated on the actual Bracero program, you know, paperwork, right, that was instituted. But nonetheless, so that leaves us here. So what have we seen? We've seen a lot of detriment, a lot of attempts at divide and conquer, but we've also seen a lot of overcoming, a lot of refusing to, you know, define ourselves in these distinct, you know, rungs and, you know, disidentify ourselves with other people who work side by side with us, whether they're Japanese workers, which there were, right? They're Japanese and Japanese American workers, Chinese and Chinese American workers, Filipino and Filipino American workers, right? Mexican and Mexican American workers, all working in solidarity, other groups as well, but those are the most predominant ones. And instead of dividing, they join together. Now we have the civil rights movement. Right, people come home from World War II and they are not willing to accept second-class treatment. Not that they ever were, that, you know, I don't want to speak wrongly, but people of color, especially now, are like, you know what? I put my life literally on the line for your government, including my grandfather, right? Who was on the second wave of my Chicano and Blackfoot Indian grandfather, who was on the second wave of Normandy, France, right? So they refused to accept like second-class treatment, right? So we have the origin of the Chicano movement, we have the origin of the Asian American movement, we have the origin of the, you know, the Black Power movement, the American Indian movement, all these movements, women liberation movement, LGBTQ movement, Stonewall Rebellion, all that, you know. So we see, we see all these groups organize and come together in cohesion. And this is where, during this time of the civil rights era, is where we see, you know, constant exploitation still, despite some achievements during, you know, through the courts. 1954 Brown versus Board of Education is one, right? Even though we start to see some achievement, we still have the constant degradation of farm workers, the people who put food on our table, make our economy #1 in California, make our economy #5 in the world. And I'm talking about degradation not only in terms of exploitative pay, horrible pay, not even having toilets in the fields. Can you imagine not having a toilet? And look, this is me as a historian. I couldn't even imagine, right? Not having toilets in the field, not having access to fresh water. They would carry like a soda can and fill it up with water, and they would share it during the whole day, 1 or 2 soda cans. They had women, let's talk about that. Women had the constant threat, Filipinas, right? Mexican American women, right? They had the constant threat of sexual violence in the fields that is often not talked about, and it's not looked at enough, I would argue. And that's where my book will come into play. It's almost done, but, you know, I hope that you guys will pick that up, you know, soon when it comes out. But, you know, not having toilets, not having access to clean water, pesticides being dropped all over them. We know pesticides are carcinogens, right? And they don't just stay on your body and affect you. They're going to affect your fertility. They're going to affect your future generations. And then simultaneously, lack of access to what? To any healthcare, let alone decent healthcare. You have lack of access to that. Like, throw all this in, working 12 to 14-hour days, being paid, you know, 75 cents, right, an hour, 75 cents an hour. It's horrendous. It's a lack of respect, and it is so frustrating, because I'm not only speaking about this in, you know, historical, you know, in the historical element. This is still happening to people as we speak, as we speak, you know, and it's so frustrating and obviously very passionate, right? So what happens out of this? Well, we have, right, Larry Itliong, who was part of AWOC, right? So the AFL, so the American Federation of Labor, he was part of that union. And there was a subgroup of it called the AWOC for short, Agricultural Workers Organizing Committee. Right, and he started actually on September 8th. He's the one who, and it's interesting. Larry is an amazing man, and I know that Larry also worked with Dolores Huerta with the CSO, the Community Service Organization that she co-founded, right, in with Cesar Chavez in 1955 in Stockton, right. So they were already friends. But he's going to organize before the National Farm Workers Association, which will soon become the UFW, United Farm Workers. He's going to institute that, and he's going to begin that even a week before the UFW says on Mexican Independence Day, yes, let's join our brethren, let's join our sisters, let's join our Filipino, family, and let's join them in this strike. And it was a national, it grew into a national grape. So not only strike, it began as a strike, but it turned into a boycott. Right, which is phenomenal, right? And Larry is a phenomenal figure because from all the readings that I've done on him, and obviously my book is on Dolores Huerta, right? So I know more about her, but I will say that, researching him, he's a very kind and calm person, very, very passionate. And he would go to, I read that he would go to local pool halls, and he would go to houses very similar to what Dolores Huerta would do, right? She was very personal, right? She would go to homes and talk to people about organizing. That's how she got people to register to vote under the CSO, right? The Community Service Organization. Right. And so let's get into her really quickly. She's an amazing figure, born in Dawson, New Mexico. April 10th is her birthday, 1930, right? And she's still alive and she's still an activist, amazing woman, right? And I find it frustrating that I am thankful, let me begin here, that there's a lot of books on Cesar Chavez, right? I'm very thankful, but I find it an omission, a very sad omission of history, that there's not enough written on Dolores Huerta, and there's not enough written on Larry Leong, and there's not enough, knowledge about the Filipino involvement as well, right? So I just want to say, I recognize that as well, right? And so she began, she was a school teacher. She left because she couldn't face children every day who were, either wearing mismatched shoes, no shoes at all, who were arriving to school hungry, who would fall asleep on their desk because they were malnourished. And so she went to the principal and she said, can we do something, right? And she said, can we do something for these children? Oh, sorry, that's just the way it is. They're children of farm workers. As if that was a rationale for hey, well, don't worry about it. That's just what it is. And she said, no, she refused to accept that. So she left teaching, right? And she already at this time, right? She already had 4 children. She left teaching, and she was introduced by Fred Ross, who was an organizer under the CSO who had opened previous chapters. He introduced her, Dolores to Cesar, and they didn't become immediate friends. Dolores always said that he was very quiet and he wasn't like this passionate speaker that he's known to be. He was more reserved. But through the months, right, she heard him speak, in particular one time at a house, advocating for not just voting rights, but also for labor rights, and that struck something with her. And so they will co-found the Stockton chapter in 1955 of the Community Service Organization. However, they didn't think it did enough for farm workers, and that they were both, having, Cesar already himself having been in the fields, and then also Dolores here and there, but in the onion fields during the summer vacations. But really her mom kept her out of those predominantly. But her father, before he was in mining in Dawson, he was actually also a migrant farm worker, right? Went to Wyoming and different places, right? Following that. So they decide to leave the CSO and open, create their own union. And this is in 1962, because they were interested. They felt like enough wasn't being done under the auspices of the CSO. They appreciated Fred Ross, they loved him, but they wanted to do even more for the farm laborer, because they believe firmly that you could not change the conditions of the future, the conditions of the children, the conditions of the present, if you did not fundamentally change the economic and socio-political structure of the actual farm workers themselves. So they wanted them to have the right to organize, right? So if we fast forward now to 1965, right, we have, workers in Coachella had gone on strike previous, right? So that was in August. of 1965, and they received a wage increase, but it was not followed, and it was a slight one, but it was not followed suit. That wage increase was not followed suit in Delano. So what ended up happening was that you have Larry Itliong, who organizes from a very grassroots level. He says, you know what, we're going to do what we did in Coachella, and if it takes longer, then it takes longer. And so he invited, Dolores Huerta, Cesar Chavez to organize with them, and they did. They decided to on September 16th is when they joined, but the actual strike began on September 8th with Larry Itliong, and this lasted all the way until 1970. Right? Dolores was an amazing negotiator. She was, she negotiated more of the contract. She was actually responsible for negotiating the first successful contract with Shenley Industries. And that was in April of 1966. That was less than a year before the actual, when the strike began in 1965, was on like 6 months later, she negotiates the first contract. And it's amazing for a woman to be, it's amazing what everyone did. And I want to underscore that, but it's amazing for a woman, in particular, a woman who's a single mother, right? Who now by this time already has more kids, right? So now she has 7 kids, right? So who's a single mother who is living on a subsistence of $5 a week to, not only devote her life to the cause La Casa, right? But also to, be the first woman to go in and get a successful negotiation with one of the largest agribusinesses, right, in the San Joaquin Valley, right? So it's amazing, right? So she's an amazing figure. So it was a collectivity overcoming these, these separations, and the Filipinos and the under the auspices of the AFL. Right, so they were still part of that, and under the auspices of what becomes the UFW, they worked together in cohesion. It took 5 years. 5 years before 27 of the largest, there were some who didn't sign still, but 27 of the largest growers in California finally, conceded to the demands and allowed for organized labor in their, under their auspices, under, their agribusinesses, right? And so it's sad too, because as soon as the grape boycott ends, seriously, the same day, they hear about the need for a lettuce boycott, because what has happened now is that you have the Teamsters who are brought in, who are basically like what they called sweetheart deals, who are brought in and to try to dish out as minimal concessions as possible that really don't alter the state of exploitation, don't alter the state of lack of safety codes, don't change the fundamental sexual violence and exploitation of these women, don't change any of the circumstances for the children, don't give them any of the farm worker disability or any insurance or anything like that. So now a new strike begins in 1961, right? So that's the lettuce strike. And then it come again, right? Or excuse me, 1971, I apologize. And then again, right after this, then we have, the next couple of years, these agribusinesses now start to, the contracts end, and they refuse to re-sign contracts with their workers. So then another national grape boycott begins as well, right? So it's this constant movement and this constant work between, the UFW, right, with Dolores Huerta truly as the head of the negotiating team, right? And Cesar Chavez is very important, but she was equally as important. And it's sad to me that there's not much written about her, right? And so when I've been doing my research, especially during COVID, it's been extremely hard for me to find sources, on her, right? So that being said, right, so it's a culmination alongside, right, the Filipino workers and their union as well, right? So that's a lot of history and a little bit of time, but I thank you for that.
Thank you very much for that, April. Everybody, please show April Taya some love on the chat because we're not allowing you to unmute yourselves right now. But thank you so much, April. Really appreciate your words and bringing everything into context.
You're so welcome. Thank you so much for having me. I feel honored to be alongside two major, movers and shakers in the labor movement. Thank you. Good job. Thank you. Go on.
All right. Well, thank you so much for that, April. There was such an incredible amount of historical perspective, and you brought me back to my undergrad in urban and regional planning, where I learned a lot about these untold stories and in my own personal experience. So I really thank you for bringing us back and putting that into perspective. And I'm excited for this portion for many different reasons. But first of all, I want to, recognize and bring to the stage, if we can spotlight Alex Edilor and Roger Gadiano. They are what I call my Manongs, Manong Alex and Manong Roger. They are storytellers who we met a couple years ago when we took up a group of students, about 40 students, as I mentioned before, to visit and learn about the Delano Manongs. And they'll tell you more about that in their storytelling with their time with us today. But just to share with you perspective, and I'll share a little bit about my personal background. I was and am the daughter of Filipino immigrants who, after World War II, had moved to the island of Guam, where I was born and raised. And so my privileges are because of that, that particular reason. I thought about that when April talked about the Spanish-American War and what that meant for Filipinos and ultimately those in Guam as well as World War II. So I am the product of those historical events. But Manong, if I can share with you, I believe is in Tagalog. I could be wrong, but Alex and Roger can correct me, denotes really what we call an older male, oftentimes an older brother, not an uncle. And it's always preceded by the person's actual name as a reverence, as a way to give respect. For me growing up, that word was actually kuya. I did not use Manong. But it is used similarly in that way. So for a long time, I never knew what my older brother's name was actually because I had to call him Kuya. Otherwise, I'd be in deep trouble. So I just want to start there. But I want to thank you both for being here. We're excited to really kind of put the spotlight now on you, but also the spotlight on the untold stories of the farm workers movement. So I know that I've been privileged. Tassi and I and Carol have been privileged. Some of the students in here who were able to go to that field trip. We're privileged to have that experience with you. And that's always been such a memorable event that's been etched into my heart, not my mind, my heart. So this is particularly special for me to be able to bring you here today to shed light on what these stories were that most people don't really know about. So with that, I give it over to Tassi to get us started.
Thank you so much, Ida. I just wanted to echo the words that she shared. That experience that we had there in Delano with both Alex and Roger was so impactful that, of course, we have them back for Larry Itliong Day, and we're able to have them back again today to share with us, to share with our community at Mount Sac more about those untold stories. As Ida mentioned, being there in Delano with these gentlemen, it was so moving that we went around to all these important places, and it was like we were there, and they took us and they told the stories, and the stories came alive. And so everyone here, Mount Sac community, I know as Alex and Roger share their stories, share their answers, that they're going to be making the stories come alive. With that, I want to jump into my first question. I want to open up to both Alex and Roger. What is your observation or understanding about the Filipino community's daily experience during the strike? So again, as I mentioned, you brought it alive to us when we visited. If you can bring that alive to us right now.
Good morning.
Go ahead, Roger. You can start with this.
Well,
we discussed this earlier.
When Larry organized in '65, I was a senior in high school. I learned how to speak English finally, because I'm an FOB, fresh off the boat. I actually came on a boat from the Philippines. I was born there. I'm a native Filipino, but when I came to America, I didn't know any English at all. So they sent me back a year, and so I should have graduated in '65, but I graduated in '66. So, but in the in the fall of '65, the strike started. And my dad, we had a store, and we supplied all the Calrose rice 100-pound sack to all the Filipino labor camps from Arvin all the way to Bakersfield. That's a stretch of 125 miles. And the strike took the town by surprise, because see, when Larry organized, he got the city people to take the vote, but the people that actually struck were in the labor camps. And the labor camps were dominated 100% almost by Filipino single man labor who are in their 40s and 50s. Okay. And then in town were all the mestizo families. All the half white, Mexican, black, you name it, we had it. Native Americans. We married everybody. There was no bar. We didn't hold anybody back. So, and then so we were. You could count all the pure Filipino families like me in your hand. There were probably about a dozen at the most, but the rest are. I grew up. The ratio between Filipinos and purebloods, between mestizos and people like me, were like 50-1 in Delano. So the people forget the mestizo population in Delano, Stockton, and Salinas Valley was dominantly mestizo. Because of the miscegenation laws and the Filipinos going on property. It was a mess. But anyway, I grew up in Delano, and when the strike started, it was like a shock. They knew it was coming, but they didn't know what was to come. It brought tension in the city. People got laid off from work. Over the years, the labor camp starts closing, and it killed my dad because we ran the store. We had workers to pay. Revenue coming in was low, and then workers that weren't working, we gave them utang, which is credit, no interest, and then pay you when you can. Because Delano back then we were a migrant community. People moved from place to place to work. You could be in asparagus. We had Mexican friends that I went to school with. I wouldn't see them for 3 months. I said, where you came from? Oh, I came from Washington, and we were picking apples. This is what happens in a migrant labor community. And Filipinos do Stockton asparagus. Seattle, go to Alaska to the fisheries. So there was a lot of changes. It was upheaval for a while until it settled down. Like Professor Telez said that because I still live in I'm here right now. I still live in Delano. I haven't moved. And then I ran crew. I had 10 Mexican crews and 2 Filipino crews for 15 years. So, I mean, if anybody knows great work, I do. We work in the dirt. That's what farm labor do. We don't go out in a nice office with air conditioning. We got to face the elements. In the wintertime, there's frost on the vines because it's under 32 degrees. In the summertime, it could be 105, 10 days in a row. These are the elements farm workers live through. But anyway, in 65, it sent the town into shock. They didn't know what was coming up. And then to make it then white people and the power structure growers could not believe that, the Filipinos and Mexicans were trying to undo injustice. They were trying to correct an injustice. So they labeled the strike as a bunch of commie puppets led by socialists and stuff like that, which is baloney, and but all this didn't happen. I mean, it happened over time. It didn't like a slap in the face. It's like it just ate up on you. But anyway, I got more stories, but right now things are okay. Things have improved a little bit, but at the time it was rough. It was rough go.
Yeah. Let me interject. I was a little younger than Roger. I too was born in the Philippines. I came here when I was 5 with my older sister and my mom. My dad, who served in the U.S. military during World War II from the Philippines, he was the Philippine Scout, earned his citizenship. And so 7 years after the war was over, he decided to take advantage of that and come to the United States because of the lure. They were recruiting people. There was always the Americans who kind of had the Philippines since the Spanish-American War kind of painted this picture of the United States being the land of plenty. And of course, a lot of Filipino men went out and tested it to see if it was true. My dad was one of those. He came over in 52. He became a migrant worker. He was like all the other manongs. And then he saved up enough money to bring his family over. So we got here in 1959, and life from a kid's point of view is just all about school, playing with friends, watching TV. So it was like this Leave It to Beaver environment, you know, just mom, dad, and the kids. And all of a sudden, in September 8th, 1965, just all hell broke loose. I came home from school. I was in the 6th grade, and I would come home as a latchkey kid. My mom, we had no daycare at the time, so my mom would pin the house key to my pants pocket, and I would come home to on my own and make myself a sandwich, watch TV, and wait for my mom and dad to show up. Well, on September 8th, it was a little bit different, a lot different. I came home and they were already home, and so my mom and dad said we were on strike, and so I knew this was something big. And so, it was, there was a lot of tension at the dinner table. From my vantage point, things were not the same. Children that we used to play with, all of a sudden we kind of like became separated because they weren't part of the strike, or they were part of the strike and left. So it really just huge social upheaval. Filipinos and Mexicans and of course the whites. And Delano, like a lot of other communities back then, had its the west side, west of the freeway, was where all the Filipinos and the Mexicans were, and on the east side was everybody else. And I can count in one hand from kindergarten to 8th grade how many non-Filipino, non-Mexican kids there were. There were a few blacks, there were a few whites, but we're predominantly Filipino, Mexican Americans. Then all of a sudden, the strike happened, and just turmoil. It just wasn't the same. We go to church, and there was Cesar Chavez there, and everybody else, and so the strike split the community up. There were a lot of families because the father was a labor contractor. He was not for the strike. It just caused a lot of tension, and like Roger said, with his business, it was a great upheaval. I remember going to high school in '68, and I was in classroom with a grower's kid. Of course, he asked me a question if I was with the strike, and I said, well, my mom and dad struck, but we went back to work, and I don't know whether he was trying to, step on my toes a bit, but, we had to go to school. We played football and basketball with the growers' kids, but there was always that tension, about whether you were with the union or you're not with the union. And so, it was not very, very good from September 8th, 1965 on. It quieted down some. But I think over the years, we can look at that as that, what, in order to affect change, you have to mess the table up.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
You have to turn over the tables and say, what, we may be happy here, but this is not what's right.
Exactly. And Alex, I'm so happy you brought that up. It's about like disrupting. We talk a lot about in academia about disrupting systems, and about that's the only way change comes, right? Is if
that's the only way change comes.
We bring that awareness. And so that's something that I learned from the both of you while being out there in Delano.
Yeah.
Alex, thank you so much for sharing your personal experiences, going to church with Cesar Chavez, going to church with all these folks who made changes there. Roger, when you mentioned about the work conditions, it reminded me of when we were there. I got off of our privileged air-conditioned bus, went to there in the community center. We were even underneath the the shade and it was still hot and we were just standing there. So I couldn't imagine. So I kind of want to, if I can ask this question to Roger. Roger, you talked a lot about, a lot of the diversity, a lot of different ethnicities that were there in Delano. What were the relationships and interactions like between the Filipino and Mexican farm workers and their families?
Well, one, we were all farm workers. We all work in the fields. The grapes are the same for everybody. Okay. The dirt's the same for everybody. The pesticides are the same for everybody. We're farm workers. But you go to work. I mean, you got to bring your in Filipino, your baon, your lunch, or your comidas if you're Mexican. So what we went through, they went through too. And that's the farm worker life is the same. It's I when I was supervising crews, I go to lunches and I never brought lunch. No, not during when I was running crew for picking, because the Mexicano ladies would say, Rogelio, quiere un taco? Simón, dámelo. I would say, for sure, give me some. And the Filipino says, gusto mo? Do you want some? I said, yeah. Ulam, food. I said, yeah, sure. And anyway, so you have to they know what they are. But they work hard. And then they know that if they weren't out there, they wouldn't be able to buy the food. They wouldn't be able to buy that used car or live in a house. And they for the most part, farm workers are happy because they're, here's the thing. When I was running crews, I know I broke the law. Well, we were doing pasas, raisins. It was Saturday. And then here's what happened. The Mexicans were there and they wanted to make more money. So I said, go ahead. Well, they opened the back pickup and all these kids come out. They're underage and they were helping their father pick raisins so they can make more bonus because it's per tray. It's piecework. So I just said, oh, don't say nothing, go ahead. So but the thing is that what I came out with, the kids saw what their parents did and the kids were willing to help their parents. A lot of times kids don't know what their parents do, but the farm workers' kids know what their parents do. That there's no, they know they're working hard. There's no shame in it. And, a lot of people don't understand that. So when we were in high school, summer, we didn't go to camp. We went to labor camp. So when we were trying to make money, Alex knows, we went to Padillo's labor camp, trying to make money for school. Well, we knew what our parents did, because they worked there too. So there was no shame in it. We knew what hard work was.
I love that. I love that, Roger. Thank you so much for sharing, giving us that perspective. Got me a little emotional when you said that, where, the children are helping their parents. We both our Mexican American and our Filipinos, we come from collectivist cultures, right? And of course, if one needs help, then we're there, no questions asked to help. So it would only make sense. So I don't think you're breaking the law, so don't worry about that. But thank you, Roger, for giving us, just realizing how both the Filipino and Mexican farm workers work together, that, everyone was working together to, have the success of their families, feed their families. But just that was beautiful how you shared that. I want to move on to the next question. If I can give this to Alex. Alex, what do you think are the misconceptions about the movement? I know you've shared this before in the conversations we have, particularly the women's involvement, but what do you think are some of the misconceptions?
Well, the biggest misconception, and it's still I still hear it today, is that some uninformed people still think that still ignored the fact that the Larry Itliong and his AWOC originated the strike. I had a good friend I grew up with. I was on a PBS documentary about Filipinos and Asians. And when I mentioned that Larry Itliong and the Filipinos started the strike September 8th, he texted me right away. He said, I didn't know that. I thought it was Caesar. No, it's Larry Itliong started it. Cesar Chavez came in 8 days later, and together they formed the United Fire Workers Union. But the other aspect about it is the unsung heroes behind it. You see Larry Itliong, Cesar Chavez, Ben Gines, Philip Veracruz, Pete Velasco, all those figures, right? They're all men. But as anybody knows from the Hispanic and the Filipino culture, behind every good man, there's a good woman. And I want to mention that during the first several months of the strike, the Filipino Community Hall served as the strike headquarters. There were 3 Filipino women who would man the kitchen, and they would prepare breakfast, lunch, and dinner for the strikers. So these 3 women were just like we're like angels in the movement. I mentioned the story about my mom. My mom, in her own small way, was the labor leader. Even before the strike, and I told the story to Ida. Even before the strike, my mom wrote a letter to the grower, her boss, and in it she said, except for 2 or 3 jobs in the grape fields, the women worked side by side with the men. But why is there a pay discrepancy? The men were paid $1.15, and the women were paid 90 cents an hour. She wrote him a letter and sent it on. And of course, the other women in the work crew goes, "Oh man, you're gonna get us all fired. What did you do this for?" Right? So one day there was a dust cloud. It was the grower. He rolls in his pickup truck with a paper in hand. He walks up to the work crew and says, "Which one of you sent this letter to me?" Of course, all the women pointed to my mom. "Oh, she did it. She did it." And you know what? The grower walks up to my mother and says, "I read the letter to my wife." This is the grower talking. "I gave the letter to my wife, and I asked her, can you answer this question?" And she goes, "No." "Why are the women paid 15 cents an hour less?" He had no answer. And so what he told the work crew that day was that for the next pay period, we're going to pay everybody $1.10. So that gender gap, my mom, by writing a little letter, got things rolling. So I want to mention the women. You mentioned already Dolores Huerta. I mean, there's Esther Manzano was instrumental with the newspaper El Malcriado. There's the women who ran the hall, and so the misconception that this was run by men needs to be smashed. There were men and women side by side in the whole thing. So that's what I want to say. Is just the women were just an important part. Lorraine Agtang, who lives in Sacramento now, she was a teenager when she went on strike. She stayed with the union. She was the first director for Agbayana Village when it opened up. She was very instrumental in maintaining that village for us. And so, and again, another woman. So you can say that the farm workers movement, the grape strike, was the harbinger of things to come. It opened up opportunities for women to join in the movement as well.
Hey, thank you for that, Alex. That story was, I felt so honored to hear that story when just before we were leaving Delano, and you shared that about your mom. And I believe you also mentioned that back in the Philippines, she was actually an educator.
Yes, she was a teacher.
she was a teacher. And so to come to this country and not be able to actually work in that profession, but she had to provide for her family, her young children, so that they would have opportunities. That's always stuck in my mind. I want to turn to Roger about, because I feel that answer you gave us, like that story you share with us, is about like your mom and other women as forgotten heroes of the farm workers movement, right? So I wanted to ask Roger that same question. Like, Roger, who is your forgotten hero of the farm workers movement, and what was their contribution to the struggle for social justice?
Well, actually, Marissa Roy made that movie, The Forgotten, the Monos, The Forgotten Heroes of the Strike. What people forget was that Delano, the Filipinos that went on strike were in the camps, were in the labor camps. And then the labor camps are 99% dominantly held by Filipino men in their 40s and 50s who are single. And you know, and you know, the strike didn't come out of the community of Delano. They came out of the labor camps. That's what triggered it. And once Larry cracked that, it started to roll. I mean, they're the forgotten heroes. I mean, imagine this ain't the Ford assembly line where they can just stop the conveyor belt and boom, everything stops. We're talking about labor camps that are 30 miles apart, and everybody went on strike in the same time, the same day throughout the valley. Isn't that amazing? I mean, just to think of it. I mean, you know, that's organization. That's Larry Itlian. And you know, those are the guys that followed him, believed in him, and they did it. I mean, I had Mano Maximo. Alex knows him. He used to drive my mother around town because she didn't know how to drive. But anyway, he went on strike. He was living in town, but he still went on strike because you know the word got out, and so even the locals in town, like Alex's dad, they all went on strike at the same time, but in different labor camps. Now, like you know, that's an art. I mean, that's logistically that was hard to do, but they pulled it off. You know, this is not assembly line. You just hit one switch and everything dies. No, you got labor camps scattered all over the valley, and to pull that off was amazing. That's what it tickles my heart to see that they could do it.
Wow, that's incredible. I can't even imagine what that moment was when they essentially left the fields for that momentous, you know, marking of the movement. What would later become known as the movement, right? Because at that time it was about just having been fed up and standing for something that they felt was necessary. And we're talking about exploitation and just the things that were essential to living.
Well,
right? Solidarity and that.
That's it.
You know, and I know we're going to have time for our audience to kind of share, reflect, and ask more questions. But I have a couple more questions that I really want to drive about this untold story and this movement. And I would ask from your experience, you know, in your lived experiences, the memories that you hold in your heart, what are the lessons from the farm workers movement that can be applied to today's social injustice issues as we've seen unfold even in this last year? What would those lessons be that you think are important to convey from the farm workers movement?
Go ahead, Alex.
Well, you know, I would start off by saying that, again, going over to my analogy with turning the table over, that any social change will follow after great sacrifice. I mean, you have to put your life and your earning at risk in order to affect any change. Larry Itliong, in a famous clip, I wish I had it with me, but one of his viewpoints was that, listen, you know, if you want your rights and justice, you have to take it. You can't wait for the system to give it to you. Okay? You have to march in the streets. You have to buck the trend. You have to turn over the apple cart again, to get them to notice you. And that's what happened last summer. I mean, the situations with the George Floyd and all the other Breonna Taylors and stuff, it caused people to get out of their seats and walk the streets. And that's how you can, that's how you have to affect change. That's the one thing that Mononera taught us. And Mononera took Roger and me under his wing after the in the early 70s. We'd go over to his house and have a beer or two, and he would
and a cigar.
Share stories. And the lesson from that was that you have to be that spur on the side of somebody's side, make it comfortable for them. You have to be the kind of word was the pill. You have to be a pill in order to affect change. Stand up for stuff. So go ahead, Roger.
Yeah, but farm workers, especially the Mexicans and Filipinos who were working the field, they know they were getting screwed. They know they were getting screwed bad and they were getting underpaid. But what people forget was there was no farm labor laws. Yeah. Nothing about pesticide rules, nothing about overtime, nada. There was nothing. They didn't care about us. We were in the backwoods of the laws. I mean, they had laws for everybody else, but didn't have it for farm workers. So that, and the thing about your question was what you need to put laws in the books. A good example, Rob Bonta, the first Filipino assemblyman, he got Filipino history in the books. I mean, how in the hell would the kid? They don't give a hell about Filipinos in the books. Somebody has to tell them. You have to legislate the law, So we didn't have any farm workers. I mean, no one cared about farm workers. They didn't care about farm worker rights. No one. So what the union did is by unionizing and organizing the union, they brought up all these evils that the growers are doing to the farm workers. And by doing that, it spurred, I mean, when they boycotted, and then they told the white people, don't buy grapes, and they told them the story, they didn't buy the grapes. You have to educate the public. You have to reach out to a wider audience. Otherwise, you're not going to accomplish anything, and they did that. And that's the beauty of the strike. That's the beauty of Cesar. That's the beauty of Larry Itliong. They did something that was really great. They exposed the injustice to farm labor, and thank God for the both of them.
Thank you for that. You know what just hit me right now? As I mentioned, my parents immigrated to Guam after World War II. First my dad, and about a decade after my mom. But he moved to Guam after the war because there were job opportunities in construction to rebuild the island. He could have easily been on a ship and sent to the shores of western coast, and could have easily been among the Larry Itliongs. It just dawned on me right now, and I'm so emotional. And ever since I've met the two of you, it has been my personal commitment to make sure that these stories are not forgotten, because I know how important they are to you and the community up in Delano. And I know we're going to transition. So this final question that I have for you each, what is it that you want others to know about the Delano Manongs and the Filipino activists? What do you want our young college students to never forget about their untold stories?
Yeah.
Well, you know what? I think we discussed this earlier, but for me, the grape strike kind of indirectly challenged me to be a better me. It made me woke to the fact that I matter. I'm a United States citizen, naturalized, but I'm a United States citizen, and I deserve the space on this earth to be who I am. Prior to the strike, I think we had a colonial mentality that you know what, everything's going to be given to us by the European Americans. You know, we're not going to get it, get what we want. We'll just wait for it. And I saw it in my mom and dad. My mom and dad had, you know, they still revered General MacArthur. You know, his promise to return to the United States. And I learned in college that, you know what, that General MacArthur was an egomaniac. And, you know, and so I began to realize as a young man that what Larry Itliong did, what my mom and dad did was, you know, kind of stand up for yourself. You're Filipino you're a stranger in a strange land. And that, you know what, you're just as important as somebody who's a native there. You know, we're by birthright that we are equal individuals. And I think if nothing else, the strike should tell us that just because you're a lowly farm worker, you deserve as much as anybody else. You deserve the right to have bathrooms, to have breaks, to have medical insurance. That's one of the things that people forget, that the union brought a health clinic to Delano. It saved a good friend of ours' lives because he had valley fever and nobody would treat him except for the union clinic. So it took the union and that movement to kind of raise us as Filipinos. I can only speak for Filipinos to be, you know, to be better. And yes, don't relegate yourself to being just a farm worker. I'm a farm worker, damn it, you know, and I stand equally. I mentioned so before the strike, I felt like this as a kid. We were like invisible. My mom and dad would come home from work and go pay the bills and stuff. I'd accompany them, but you know, people just ignored us. We were just, oh, here come the farm workers. They're coming into town, you know. We're just invisible. And I think because of the strike, I think we just stood a little bit taller. Delano became a very integrated community. There was the west side, east side, but after the strike, everybody moved around, and it changed the dynamics of the town. And if there's a sociological experiment or study of Delano, the grape strike was a major influence in changing the demographics of that community. And today, I think every city council member is of color. Every school board members, Filipinos, Blacks, and Mexicans. Prior to the strike, there was none. And point of fact, in 1966, Larry Itliong was the first Filipino American to run for city council. He lost, but then 6 years later, Leonard Velasco became the first Filipino elected to city council. And so I think the grape strike and the social injustice movement, you know, just empowers formerly disenfranchised people like ourselves. And you know, the farm workers had no protections. I was thinking about that during Professor Tellez's thing, but of all the minimum wage requirements, the $15 minimum wage was discussed. Well, you know what? Since the 1900s, minimum wage never applied to agricultural workers. We were always below minimum wage. So everybody was talking about minimum wage is only $7.25. Yeah, but we're earning $6 as farm workers. And you know, that to me, that just baffles my mind why farm workers were always exempted. Again, another measure to just minimize the farm worker. So anyway, I could go on, but I'll leave it for Roger as well.
Well, you know, they're all dead now. All the monos.
Yes.
The ones that walked out, the ones that lived in labor camps. There wasn't a few hundreds that came over in the boat. There were thousands of them. And the thing is, 90% of them probably had unfulfilled dreams. You know, they sent back money to islands and stuff like that. And a lot of them didn't even, they went there and they couldn't, they had to come back. They liked America. It was sad. A lot of them died alone without family. I know because I had to attend those funerals at the Guadalupe Church for my mother. She goes, my uncle's died. You got to go. So I go, well, I went. But you know, they did a good. But what they don't know is they did a good thing. All those the forgotten heroes. You know that they're the ones that walked out, and people should remember that they did a good thing for a lot of people. They did a good thing for a lot of farm workers of today. You know, to the point how they scared the farm workers, they scared the owners. Excuse me. Now the owners, after 40 hours, you get some kind of medical card now. You know, after 10 after 10 hours, you actually got a time and a half. It's you got to make 50 hours now. Okay, but you know that's increments. You know, when we got pesticide rules, when you go in and they spray it, they put a post, they put a thing on the corner. You can't enter for 10 days. You know, stuff. I mean, OSHA goes out and checks the bathrooms to make sure they ain't contaminated and they ain't got bacteria running around. They got toilet paper, ass gaskets, you name it. You know, hey, I want to credit Governor Jerry Brown, the second one. He did a lot. He opened up the court systems for farm workers. I mean, you know, this is the upshot of the strike. They improved the lives of a bunch of all the farm workers all over the United States. In fact, unemployment insurance, if you're in Texas or New Mexico or Arizona, and you come to California, they pool your unemployment pay. I mean, they didn't do that before. So, you know, it's so you don't have to get kicked out of your house and lose your mortgage and all that. You know, you got some safety. Of course, we're not making $1 billion, but you know what? We can buy a car, get cable TV, you know, and then fill the fridge up. You know, that's an improvement. The issues we have today now is heat. You know, when do you send them home? They're sending them home early. If it's over 105, they send them home early. Issues of pesticides. You got to tell the farm workers how to wash and keep the stuff away from them. And you know that because pesticides and herbicides, they're all new, and you don't know their effect. So you know they got to watch for that. I mean, that's ongoing. That's you know, because chemicals change all the time, but people still work in the fields. So you know those issues are going to be around. So I think even though the Huelga's not organizing that they used to, at least when something goes down, they get on their horn and put out some loud noise to tell the farmers we're watching you, you know, and but you know Larry Leon, Cesar Chavez, that's how they started the whole mess, and you know more power to them. Thank you.
Thank you, Alex and Roger, for sharing so much of your wisdom, your stories. I feel like I'm back there again in Delano. I'm going to turn this over to Tahasi. I can't wait till we can go back there to see you all again.
Yeah.
Tahasi?
Same here.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Alex and Roger. I don't know, can everybody see this picture? Can everybody see it?
Yes.
Okay, so I love this photo. We're looking at it more today. It is of both Alex and Roger, and I'm so grateful for their stories, grateful for them being here. We honor you. Alex, you said something that has resonated with me. Because of the strike, we were able to stand a little taller. And I want you to know from us to you that because of your stories, continuing their legacy, that all of us are able to stand a little taller. Ida mentioned this quote earlier today. Ida, you want to share a little bit about that real quick? Or you want me to share it?
Yeah.
Okay, it says, the day we stop burning with love, our people will die of the cold. And so as you continue to share your stories, as you continue to continuing to share that love, that burning love, we continue to grow. So again, we just want to thank both Roger and Alex. With this time right now, I want to turn it over to Fabian for our last portion.
Thank you so much. Really appreciate you all. And so for this next portion, we're going to get into a little bit of storytelling. We understand that there's folks here who are participants, but we're also involved to a degree or another, whether they were actually there in the movement or they have family members or they're close to the movement. So we're going to open it up to that. But before we do that, I'm going to turn off the live stream on YouTube because for this, we do want to respect the folks who share. We want to respect everybody's privacy. So we're going to stop live streaming. And Annabelle, if you wanted to introduce